Good evening, everyone. I hope that your week is going okay. I'm very grateful to all of you who are tuning in to our summer guest speaker series. I know that so many of us are feeling anxious right now. We're looking for guidance from God. We are turning to Scripture in these times of uncertainty, of sickness, of injustice, of violence. And so I'm grateful to be able to rely on a network of friends in ministry who can bring a word from the Lord to us. So in these weeks, we're going to just have conversations. Most weeks we'll start out with me just talking to someone about what things have been like lately. And then I'm going to turn the screen over to them for them to give the closest thing to a guest presentation to all of us who are watching. So I am grateful at this time to bring our first guest speaker onto the screen. This is Tim Pyles. Tim, good to see you this evening. Things are going okay?
Things are going okay. Things
Great.
are going better than they were a couple of months ago, for sure.
Good. Well, you know, Tim, when you bring a guest speaker to your church, you usually work up a really nice introduction for them. And I've been kind of busy this week, and I didn't have time to do it. And I know someone who might be able to do that better. And so, yes. So my sister-in-law is going to introduce you. Hannah, you might let people know why you're introducing this guest speaker. So I'm going to take myself off the screen. Hannah, would you introduce our guest speaker tonight?
Absolutely, I would love to. Hello, everyone. My name is Hannah Kincaid, and Tim Pyles is my dad. And I have the wonderful pleasure of introducing him to you tonight. I have been unable to see my dad since Christmas, so this is a really big deal for me, and I love you very much. So, Tim Pyles is an incredible person. He has been a pulpit minister in Alabama, Tennessee, Texas, Australia, Hawaii, and for the last 11 years, Oklahoma, specifically Broken Arrow. He lives there with my mom, Kim, his wife of 32 years, and my brother, Coleman. And I have just a couple of minutes to speak, and I know I can't convey the admiration I have for my dad in just those 2 minutes, but I really, really admire this man. He gives me the courage and the example to be the best I can be at everything, from my job to my marriage to even a gardener, which he is a wonderful expert at. I don't have a 12-foot okra plant just yet, but I will get there. The dedication that you show every day to Coleman, our sweet little special needs Coleman, is wonderful. And it is an example that I hope to live up to. Tim is one of the most amazing Christian men that I know. And any question I have about the word, anything that I'm struggling with, I know I can always go to him and ask him, and he's got some wonderful scriptures to reference and some wonderful life experience to also go to. So without further ado, Tim Pyles.
Love you, babe.
Thank you, Hannah, very much. Tim, isn't that a mean thing to do to someone as a surprise?
You ambushed me, man. And
I know. And now I'm going to ask you to speak to us. What a terrible thing to do to someone. Listen, I just love the cool opportunities that we have to just randomly connect people from all over the world. I was telling Hannah earlier, as we were doing the same check you and I were doing earlier with the sound check, I said, hey, we should have been doing this a long time ago and bringing in guest speakers. The technology was there, but the motivation was not. Now it is. Right. So just to make clear for anyone watching who's confused, my brother Reese is married to Hannah, and Hannah is Tim's daughter. So that's the connection between all of us. So, right. Tim, and I do want to let everyone know that at any time, as we're talking or as Tim's talking later by himself, if you have questions that you want to ask Tim, then you are welcome to ask those in the comments on Facebook or YouTube, and we will see those. I'll be monitoring those, and if there are questions we want to bring in to the screen and we can address, then we're glad to do that. So, Tim, tell me, what it's been like doing ministry the past couple of months.
Just like everybody else, you and the staff there and shepherds at Memorial Road and here at BA, all over the world, really, it's in a way that we never anticipated. And, as a part of that response, I just want to say how incredibly proud I am of our churches of adjusting to something that we never saw coming. There was no drill for this. There was no textbook. I think you can verify none of us had ever been to a lectureship or a seminar or workshop where there was a track of study called Leading Your Church Through a Global Pandemic.
Correct.
It moved fast. It happened fast. And during the first part of that, the very first week that things were shutting down, the week of March the 15th, which we had canceled services on the 14th, I was just starting to have symptoms that weekend of COVID-19. And so when it hit full force that Monday, I was pretty much out of commission for those first 2 weeks. But again, from the sidelines of illness, watching things happen, things just moved quickly. We got Call Warriors started that week. Unlike Memorial Road and some other congregations, our demographic age is pretty high. I think we have 64 households that we don't have an email address for. And so all of our online communication only goes to maybe 70% of the church. So started calling all the members every week. We had 40 volunteers doing that. Project Face Mask got started that week with face masks being made for medical professionals, those on the front lines of treatment. And let's see, COVID-19 task force, all of our college kids were home for spring break and they stayed home. And so we mobilized a lot of them to, their own personal DoorDash. They made grocery runs for people. Right. They made pharmacy runs for people. They took them masks, they took them toilet paper, they took them paper towel, whatever they needed. And then obviously everything shifting to online, live streaming of worship, Bible classes on the YouTube channel, Bible classes on Facebook, Bible classes on Zoom, meetings on Zoom. So yeah, it was a steep learning curve for a lot of us. Guys your age, adjust to that a lot easier than guys my age and older. But yeah, again, there was no way any of us could have been prepared for this, but I love the light that our churches have continued to shine. I thank God for the technology that we have. I don't know how they did it in 1918, with this flu pandemic. They probably had to send word by horseback or somebody in a buggy to let people know, hey, we're not going to be meeting this Sunday.
Yeah. I'm so grateful for the technology. There have been a few times when I'm actually envious of societies pre-Zoom. Because I think we all are grateful it's there, and we're simultaneously sick of it. I want to be with people in a room. There's only so much that I want to try to do that, but I am very grateful it's there. So you alluded to this a minute ago when you were talking about the early part of this. So you had COVID-19. You have, I guess we haven't verified this. Would you consider yourself fully recovered? Do you feel fully recovered? So why don't you tell us the story of that?
Right. Short answer to the last part of the question there. I thought I was fully recovered long before I actually was. At the point you start recovering, you feel so much better than you felt. You think you're over it. And then over the next, 5 to 7 days, you have reminders that you're not. It takes a long time to get stamina back. But yeah, all of you remember that weekend before everything started shutting down. You guys probably made the same call about March the 15th. No restrictions had been enforced yet or mandated, but we made the call on Saturday the 14th that we wouldn't meet on the 15th. I went back and looked at our communication, and that was in hopes of making some adjustments and meeting on the 22nd. Obviously, that never happened. But Friday the 13th, 14th, 15th, that weekend when we're doing all this communication, I'm just incredibly fatigued. I got a persistent headache, just won't go away. Body aches, which I dug up a stump in the landscape bed out front earlier that week, and I didn't know if that was residual, pain from that, but I was just miserable all weekend. Amazingly, had we met on the 15th, you know how it is in ministry, Josh, you suck it up and you do it anyway. I would have preached on the 15th if we had services. And I just thank God for, wisdom that he granted, for providential protection. And out of the 475 or so that would have been here on the 15th, I probably would have come into close proximity with 200 plus.
Sure.
How Sundays are, hugging, handshakes, all that. So it was that Monday that the fever started, chills, shaking chills, loss of taste that lasted for about 10 days. Ended up losing about 12 pounds through that process because everything tasted like metal. I described it as, if you could chew a spoon, it's what you would imagine a spoon tasting like. And coffee was the worst.
Oh, that's so bad.
Cruel, it's a cruel irony there. So that was kind of my canary in the coal mine when I started recovering. When coffee tasted good again, I knew progress had been made. We finally at Kim's urging, finally contacted our doctor that Wednesday, the 18th. They had me come in for a flu test. When I got there, of course, everybody is masked and shielded. It was surreal. There was hardly anybody there. Mm-hmm. Flu test was negative, so he said, we want to swab you for COVID. And I was still, that was nowhere on my radar. Nobody's got coronavirus around here.
Yeah.
And so Coleman's symptoms started that day that I was tested. He's our 27-year-old special needs son, nonverbal. So I was told it'll be about 72 hours, turned out to be 12 days before I got my results. But Coleman starts getting really sick the 18th. I assume, looking back, that he had felt as miserable as I had felt for a few days, with no way to communicate that about any body aches or headache. It's only when his fever started that we could tell. So our severest symptoms overlap for about 6 or 8 days. He finally went in to be tested the next Monday. I think that was the 23rd, and then his test came back within a day. The testing had improved that much. His results came back positive that Tuesday. I was presumed positive. That was confirmed the next Monday, the 30th. So that just shows you how fast this thing was moving, how quickly things were improving as far as testing and result time. Just the 5 days in between us being tested, his results were back in 12 days. Mine was shipped to California for processing. And so, yeah. And again, I wish Coleman had a way to, poor guy, we just feel for him. We just had to go off of his fatigue level, the time, he was spending in bed, his fever level. He has a complicated medical history as well. First 9 years of life, he was chronically neutropenic, which amounts to an immune system failure and deficiency. His weak spot was always his lungs. The year after he was born, he was in the hospital 8 times with pneumonia. And so, we were so fearful for him, and so fearful for Kim. Kim has lupus, severe rheumatoid arthritis. We knew with her, condition, it was going to be rough. Blessedly, she was spared. Again, we just have to thank God for that, because she was our primary caregiver, and she was basically living in a petri dish with this virus for 2+ weeks, as exposed as any human being could be. Yeah. And we just thank God that she was protected. She got all kinds of stars in her crown for what she did for us. It would have been tough if she had gotten sick. Nobody would have been able to come in the house.
Yeah,
nobody could come in the house anyway. So if all of us had been sick, there's always a worst case scenario.
Yes. So as you are when you're in the middle of battling an illness that is pretty scary, that's a news story every day, and you're living in the house with 2 vulnerable persons, one of whom has the virus. Talk to me about what your faith was like, your prayers were like during that time when you had it and were uncertain exactly what was going to happen next.
Right. I knew that this was something I had never encountered before. I don't know if I've ever had the seasonal flu, so
Mm.
I really had nothing to compare it to. Um, but I went back and looked at email messages that I was sending the elders and the ministers that week that, this seems to be getting worse. Don't know what it is. I've never been this sick before. Um, the cough started, and that was a little later in the illness. And so, I prayed. I was in bed a lot. There was one day that, I was in bed most of the day, and then I slept from 6 o'clock that night to 9 o'clock the next morning. 15 solid hours, night sweats. So a lot of my praying was, 2 to 4 a.m. laying there, sheets soaked, pillow soaked, kind of like you had taken it out of the washing machine after the spin cycle and just put a pillow in it. Uh, and you're suddenly reminded of what people deal with from all kinds of sources. In regard to physical illnesses, I'm a relatively healthy person, generally speaking, and it's really easy, for those who are really healthy, even with with a wife with a chronic condition and a son with a complicated medical history, that we can be subject to compassion fatigue. We can forget what it's like for people to be really, really sick.
Sure.
At that point, I was praying, please, 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 don't let Coleman get this. Don't let Kim get this. I thought about my dad. He was a missionary. We were missionaries in Liberia, West Africa, when I was in 4th and 5th grade back in the early 70s. After the Civil War ended, he went back to Nigeria and Liberia for a visit. He picked up malaria in Nigeria, ended up in a hospital in Liberia when he got there. And I didn't appreciate it at the time after he got back and told me, about the fever and the sweat and laying there in this, I can't imagine what kind of hospital it was in that era, and thinking he was going to die there. And I just, my heart just broke that I didn't get it at the time when he told me about it.
Yeah.
So, incredible appreciation for our church family during that time. This kind of blindsided everybody. Nobody really, when the news came that Coleman was positive, and I was presumed positive, but people are already in action. I mean, from the time I was tested, I was under quarantine until we found out, and as long as I was sick. But, groceries were left on our doorstep, meals were left on our doorstep. Pharmacy runs were made for us. Kim was texting with people every day, including people who were saying, because apparently I forgot a lot that happened during that time. Kim said I would come down the stairs, my legs would be shaking, my arms would be shaking. She was communicating with people to see if somebody might be available to take me to the ER, because she had to stay there with Coleman.
Mm-hmm.
And you're just reminded of the power, the beauty of why God made us like he made us in community, of faith.
Yeah.
And it was looking recently at this figure. It's a little more subtle in the New Testament than the figure of the church as bride of Christ. There's also this figure as church of mother to God's children. And, it's in Galatians 4 and Revelation 12, 2 John 1, if you believe that the elect lady and her children are a church and the members of that family. But you talk about motherly compassion that was exhibited, and, care and nurture and all those things that all of us need. The body really provides that for us. And a lot of times in ministry, we see we're on the giving end of that, the providing end of that. And in these circumstances way beyond our control, we find ourselves on the humbling receiving end of it. And it was also a reality check for me as well. I had a month-long sabbatical back in August of 2008 for some health and mental health concerns that were going on. And one of the lessons that I learned then that I was reminded of for 2 weeks here was when I was offline, when I was out of commission, when I was sidelined, everything that needed to happen in this church family happened without me. And, it's sort of, it's a attitude corrector, when sometimes we, when we are tempted to think how indispensable we are, God reminds us that, I can use you, but if you're sidelined, somebody else is going to be there to do it.
Yeah. Hey, I'm going to ask you one more question, but I see a comment I want to bring on the screen. So this is Kim Burgess commenting, says, hello, grandchild of Richard and Emma Mosby. Enjoy listening to you every time we come to Broken Arrow. So I wanted to pass that along. Who's
Thank
watching?
you, Kim. I appreciate that. Always good to see you when you're here.
Yeah. So let me ask you one more question, and then I'm going to turn the screen over to you. So not only are we in the middle of a pandemic, but now we are in the midst of what is another national crisis. It is not new. We are becoming aware of it in different ways, and it's manifesting itself in ways that are causing us to learn new things and ask new questions and feel new anxieties. So talk to me as a minister who is called every week to speak a word from the Lord, and even more so than every other week. How are you thinking about talking to your church about what's happening when it comes to racial injustice and the protests and the riots as well? And I'm distinguishing between those two things, but
Right.
about all those things. Tell me about how you as a minister are thinking about talking to your church about those.
All right. I appreciate that, Josh, and I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts here. So, last Sunday was our first Sunday back,
Yeah.
and I was really torn. I was, everything had started. I think George Floyd's death was on Monday of last week, and things started moving quickly after that. I mean, the shock, the horror, the heartbreak of seeing yet another unarmed, subdued African American man needlessly and senselessly and maliciously lose his life at the hands of those who were sworn to protect and serve. And it just keeps happening. I mean, we had the shooting of Terrence Crutcher here in Tulsa. I think it was 4 years ago. And so I opted last Sunday to focus on, this was our first Sunday back in modified form, as you can imagine. And then as soon as the morning was over, I knew that I had to address this next Sunday. And I started praying for wisdom. And I was drawn back to Solomon's prayer, when he becomes king and God tells him, you can ask for anything you want. And Solomon, and so I identify with Solomon not as the wise king of renown, but as this overwhelmed, helpless child of a man. And that's how he expresses his prayer to God. I'm just a child, and I don't know how to do what I'm supposed to do. I don't know how to say what I'm supposed to say. So give me a discerning heart.
Yeah.
And that's been my prayer over these last few days. I called Tim Luster yesterday, the preaching minister at the North Sheridan Church, predominantly African-American church in North Tulsa. For the last 4 or 5 years, we've had an annual spring Sunday where they close up shop. They come over here to Broken Arrow. We have a combined service and a fellowship meal. And then in the fall, we go over to their place for a Sunday night. It's more workable to get those crowds together, those smaller crowds together at their place on Sunday nights. And I just, I thought about calling him last week. I'm sorry I waited till yesterday to call him, but I just called to say, Tim, I just want you to know I love you. I love our African-American brothers and sisters at North Sheridan, the African-American community in Tulsa and around the nation. And we're grieving with you. We're mourning with you. And we want to cry out with you for justice and for equality and for these vestiges of racism that really aren't vestiges, in so many places. You think about what happened in the 1960s. We're 50 years or half a century beyond that, and we're still dealing with such hatred and animosity and inhumanity. And I love our law enforcement officers and the commitment that they make, and these individuals like the 4 officers that maliciously took the life from George Floyd. They don't represent, the vast majority, just like those who are involved in the looting, in the vandalism, in the theft. They don't represent those who are making this righteous cry for equality and justice and righteousness and mercy, even-handedly, to be exhibited. And, it's we have to be able to make that distinction. And the sad part is, and Tim and I talked about this yesterday, he made that same comment that, yeah, we're hurting like we've hurt too many times before. We're hurting. And he said, we're just afraid that those who are offering this message, which is just one of senseless, destruction and vandalism and so forth, the fear is that derails and dilutes and diminishes and drowns out the message that needs to be heard. So I think there's a lot we can do as ministers, as church leaders, as leaders in our community, to stand with those, to stand for righteousness and justice and mercy, and to speak up for those from whom that has been withheld,
yes,
and to whom that has been denied. And it's okay. And I mentioned to you earlier some things from Habakkuk. Is this the time to share?
Yeah, would you? I think so I'm grateful you and I have had a conversation. What I want to do is just sort of turn the screen over to you and let you deliver a message to all those who are viewing. And then when you're done, I'll come back on and close this up. So Tim, bring us a word.
All right. I appreciate that, Josh. And I covered some of that already with the things that we were talking about. But as I was wrestling and struggling and agonizing, praying for the Lord to provide insight and wisdom and discernment to know how best to speak into this tempest and tumult that's going on around us, and how to distinguish those issues and to focus on what's really most important. My mind was drawn to Habakkuk, and you think about what's a prophet of God in the kingdom of Judah who lived 2,600 years ago in the ancient Near East. There's a universe of difference between the world he lived in and the world we live in, and yet there's so little difference. And so I communicated with the congregation yesterday before I even was out of quarantine and was back on my feet and back to ministry duties. I started sending out a daily bread email. I said it'll be 5 or 6 days a week, not promising every day of the week, but 5 or 6 days a week I've done that. Just a thought, just a scripture. And yesterday I wanted to share my struggle with the congregation. And I entitled the daily bread message, Call Me Habakkuk. And that's how the message started, call me Habakkuk. And I used these descriptors: overwhelmed, stunned, saddened, dismayed, disturbed, heartbroken, more questions than answers, a loss for words. And when you read, especially the first 4 verses of Habakkuk chapter 1, you get the sense that this isn't a guy that lived 2.6 millennia ago. He's been sitting next to me on the sofa the last week watching the evening news. And here's how verses 2 through 4 read: How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen, or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. If you skip on down to verse 13 of chapter 1, sort of a continuation of that complaint, your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? And I think, Josh, that's what you were speaking to. Why are we silent? How can we be silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? And so in that opening to that message, I just said, all around him, Habakkuk saw endless heart-wrenching examples of inequity, inhumanity, and the miscarriage of justice, mistreatment and murder of those who bore God's own image, robbery of one's fellow man of all dignity, respect, and regard. But just as sadly and disturbingly, he saw senseless violence, wanton destruction, and a blatant disregard for the rule of law, both God's and man's. And threaded through all of it was deep-seated conflict and strife. And so Habakkuk's looking for an answer. He feels like so many of us feel in the present. And he says, I'm not going to stop asking. I'm going to stand right here until I get an answer from you. And so chapter 2, verse 1, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. And so God starts giving an answer in verse 5 of chapter 1. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed, for I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if you were told. God's ways are inscrutable. Sometimes they're beyond our perception. Sometimes they're beyond our ability to fathom. But Habakkuk is convinced that God has worked mightily in the past, that he has shown up in times of need, in times of desperation. He has provided answers for his people and through his people for the greater good and the greater world. And so Habakkuk expresses that in chapter 3, verse 1. Lord, I've heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, Lord. Repeat them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. He's saying, do it again, Lord. Do it now. We need your help, and we need a voice from you. We need an answer from you. And then there's this underlying trust that Habakkuk's going to hang in there in spite of circumstances, in spite of the most dire circumstances. And then I'll just share a few closing thoughts after reading chapter 3, verses 17 through 19. He says, though the fig tree doesn't bud and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pens, no cattle in the stalls, and you can talk about, in our day and time, if we've got a global pandemic compounded by another heart-wrenching example of injustice and police brutality and unnecessary excessive use of force, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights. And so I'll just share with you how I kind of concluded that piece yesterday. I said, today I find myself struggling and fervently praying for insight into how best to speak a word from the Lord into the tumult and tempest gripping our nation. I share the shock, outrage, and heartbreak over the malicious killing of George Floyd, yet another unarmed, subdued African-American who died needlessly, senselessly, and tragically, and yet again at the hands of those sworn to protect and serve. It also deeply saddens and disturbs me when this righteous call for justice and equality through impassioned, peaceful protest is diluted, derailed, and drowned out by those simply bent on mindless violence, destruction, and mayhem and theft. And so I just asked the congregation to join me in that prayer for wisdom, Solomon's prayer for wisdom. Give me a discerning heart. Give me the boldness that I need to speak, and the courage to speak, and the willingness to speak the truth, no matter who it might unsettle, no matter who it might displease. And so I think that's where we are in so many of our churches, and I'm grateful for the voices that are there. And I pray that more voices will join the chorus of standing up with those who have suffered far too much for far too long, and to bring about real lasting change from the light of God. And that's what encourages me. In the middle of Psalm 36, it talks about, in your light, we see light. And in those few verses in the middle of that Psalm, that would be verses 5 through 9, you have words like love and righteousness and justice and the shadow of God's wings and a fountain of life. And in your light, we see light. But if you read the first 4 verses and the last 3 verses, it's filled with words like the sinfulness of the wicked, no fear of God, the proud, the hand of the wicked, evildoers. This light exists in the middle, literally in that psalm, of all this darkness. And we know how that speaks to us. We are those lights in the darkness. And so I rejoice, I take heart in the COVID-19 pandemic, the light that I see, by people on the medical front lines, by people doing extraordinary sacrificial efforts on behalf of others at great expense. And you may think, well, so many of these people aren't followers of Jesus. Understood. It may not be the express light of Christ that they're showing, but it's the light of the God of light who created them in his image. They are image bearers of God. All good has its source in him. All light has its source in the one who is light. And so I rejoice in that, we're at almost 110,000 deaths in the U.S. I think 106,000 I saw today. We have to be touched. We have to mourn. It doesn't matter how you think nationally, statewide, locally, how that pandemic has been responded to. Doesn't matter about your convictions politically. We can't help but be touched by 110,000 families who have lost loved ones. We have to mourn with them. And in this, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, I rejoice in the light that I see, not in senseless violence, in looting, in theft, but in people that are standing up, people that are speaking up, calls for righteousness and justice and equality. Those have to come from God. He is the God of mercy, the God of righteousness. And so even in all this darkness that we see, there are signs of hope. And church, let's just be that light in every way that we can, and encourage one another to be that light, and join the voices of others. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Tim. I appreciate you bringing us that word. Thank you for spending time with, it's obviously not just Memorial Road viewers tonight. I see several in the comments. I think some folks that you know. There's some folks that I know from Wichita Falls. So I'm really grateful for a chance to introduce my friends to some other friends that don't know each other. So I'm glad people have gotten to hear you. Grateful for your recovery. Grateful for your service to your church, and most of all for your friendship. So I want to close out our time together on screen with a prayer, and then I'll have just a few things to say to our viewers. So let me pray for you. Father, thank you so much for Tim and Coleman's recovery. I'm thankful that you spared Kim from the virus, and I pray that you continue to protect her. I'm grateful for Tim's heart and for his service to the Broken Arrow Church of Christ. I pray that you would bless his ministry in the days ahead as he seeks to speak truths from your word, truths that can comfort us and encourage us, truths that can convict us and unsettle us. Give all of us ears to hear our leaders who speak to us as best they know how from your word. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Tim, for being with us tonight. So let me just close us all out. Thanks for tuning in and being part of our audience for this summer speaker series. It's a pretty neat thing to be able to invite people from all over the region and all over the world, and not have to coordinate travel issues. We can just show up on a screen. So this, in many ways, we have some opportunities with this. And I'm grateful for people who will come and speak to us and make time for that. I do want to let you know next week, our speaker is Jeremy Beller, a good friend of mine from the Wilshire Church of Christ, just down the road from me here in Oklahoma City. And I am thankful for Jeremy's friendship. We've been friends for a long time. I'm really grateful for his long-time service to the Wilshire Church. And so Jeremy will be on here next week, same time, 7 p.m., here on Facebook Live and YouTube. I pray that all of you have a good week. And I want to remind you to be in prayer for our leaders, to be in prayer for justice, to be in prayer for peace, to be in prayer for healing. And I am aware that we all have a few different views on what that exactly should look like, but I know there's some things that we share in common. And so if we can pray for God to be bringing those things to us and asking Him to be giving us wisdom for what we should say and what we should do, then I'm confident in God's guidance. I'm confident that things that are wrong will be made right. So thank you all for tuning in. We will see you here next week, 7 p.m. Central Time.